of life, but it is not the life.
Well, it's a piece of living meat or whatever it is. It's the egg itself. I don't know what it's composed of.
I think the question is there's no potential. There's no potential life. So
that's what it is potential life.
No, only when it meets with the sperm and then it becomes
then it's kinetic
fertilized.
Life.
So like I got eggs from the chickens. They sit on the shelf until they rot and explode. Yeah, there's no potential there unless they're fertilized.
Oh, I disagree.
And even if they're fertilized, they require specific conditions.
I gotta check to
but anyway,
see if this is working.
Let's move on. I think we'll just.
I mean, Daryl, what do you think?
Timcast
You've been listening.
Well, I think this is
obviously
an incredibly complex moral question, right? Which is why I think the conservative perspective on this is not to seek a maximalist position, trying to ban abortion or drive it back to the first day after fertilization. But to recognize the complexity of it,
these guys
recognize that there are probably irreconcilable
on abortion right now.
views that people are going to have,
I think it's
and allow Alabama and New York to have different abortion laws that they work out through
the shit coming out of Tim's mouth.
the discourse in their democratic processes. You know, I think it's going back to the idea of like conservative. The way conservatives look at politics as something that is that we engage in to make sure that we all wake up tomorrow and we're not killing each other. I think that's in that sense the conservative way of approaching it. I mean, because we like if the way humans gave birth was a woman got fertilized and then the egg like popped out and then you put it in a plastic bag in the fridge and then it grew into a human. Like after that was just how humans evolved. Say to then we wouldn't allow abortion at all. You would have it there in the bag that came out the first day and we'd be like, no, you can't flush that thing down the toilet. We'll take it or whatever. But you can't do that to it. This question only becomes really relevant because you're dealing with a very real rights claim. A woman's right to control what goes on with her body. That is however anybody feels about abortion. You have lots of people, I think, libertarian types maybe, who are anti-abortion, but they're very they want to end the drug war because they think that a person wants to put something into their body, then they should be able to. It's bodily autonomy. It's a real argument that. That conservatives, I think, have more recently done a better job of dealing with, but it's something that it does have to be dealt with. I mean, you're talking about just basic rights when you're talking about somebody's ability to control what happens with their body.
I want to jump to this post here from our good friends over at 2X Chromosomes on Reddit. A top post says, "Delete your dating apps. No more women on dating apps is the only language men speak. Plus, the less time you spend on Tinder, the more time you can spend protesting at the courthouse. Edit. To all men coming on here crying about how you're against this, of course you are. That's the point. F off." You know what I love about this? The kind of guy that's going to go to these women and be like, "Please don't leave the dating app. But I'm for abortion.
I'm an ally.
I'm an ally." It's like
good guy.
They're just angering their own side. These men who are doing what they want. Meanwhile, conservatives are like, "No, wait, don't delete your dating apps."
Well, look, it just goes to show you that feminists don't like male feminists either.
Chill his propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, who does?
Poor Tim.
No, but I think it's funny that this is a consistent argument. So we have this one post says, "I deleted mine a while ago, but before this leak, I was just starting to consider trying again. Nope, F it. I'll stick to a vibrator in my imagination. Mr. Buzzy can't get me pregnant, can't lie about not having an STI, doesn't care if I also see Mr. Rabbit or look at a Hitachi at the store." Yo, this is...
These guys circle around and avoid
what's the right word? I don't want to say
in the issue
they're
of
crazy.
Abortion. They want to call
but they're kind of crazy to not understand the nuance in what's happening here. That they don't know what conservatives think about this.
They're trying to say
they've probably never even spoken to someone who is anti-abortion about what's really going on and why they think it. And the fact that these women probably live in blue states. I genuinely do not understand it. I don't believe they actually know what they're arguing for or against.
Technically the mom.
Do you think that's what they're doing outside the Supreme Court justice houses? They're like deleting Tinder.
Like, we're not. They're like, look, Kavanaugh, now you're not going to see me. You're going to be able to swipe, delete.
There are so many examples of the left circling back and coming back to traditional like social positions through like a back door. I remember a few months ago, I was listening to Jordan Peterson interview this child psychologist from Canada. Apparently he's a bigwig. He won like the Nobel Prize of Child Psychology or whatever. And he was he deals with like designing state interventions for children in disadvantaged homes and studies like how this affects their antisocial behavior, their violent behavior and stuff as they get older. And so he's describing how all these different programs would work, and he's describing this one in the middle. He says, so what we'll do is we'll have a social worker that'll come into the house, of a single mother who maybe doesn't have any experience, doesn't really know like how to handle certain things when the kid does this or does that, how they're trying to communicate. And the social worker will be there who has this experience, who can kind of tell them like, oh, this is what the kid is trying to do, and like kind of walk them through these processes. And Peterson kind of pauses for a minute and he goes, well, that sounds like a grandmother. And it's like, then I realized everything he had been describing were just bureaucratic replacements for all of the things that have been lost over the last several decades, and that was one of them. And this is it just sort of happens that way.
Well, I want to mention there's also an additional component to this. You're correct that the left will end up in a roundabout way rediscovering some form of social conservatism or traditionalism, and then at that point the right starts defending whatever it is the left was pushing for 50 years ago. And so historically, before we just had these like isolated nuclear families, people did tend to live with their older relatives, their older aunts or uncles or parents were still living with them, helping them with the children. And now we're at a point where people are putting their father or mother in a nursing home when it's unnecessary, just because they don't want to deal with them, and they're calling themselves pro-family conservative.
Have you seen now what the far right is pushing? This is how it's here. They want this insane meme of rejecting modernity and returning to tradition. You're going to be shocked by what I'm going to show you. In a tweet from Jack Posobiec, he says, remember what they took from you.
He's
and
right,
this
though.
shocking image.
Dare they?
It's Pizza Hut and the Pac-Man machine, Book It, the red cups, the little dinosaurs, Care Bears, the Pizza Hut lamp. So Jack has been going on this, Pizza Hut nationalism thing?
He loves Pizza Hut.
Where it's like, Pizza Hut used to be great, and now it's, basically, I'm kidding, by the way, about the far right stuff. The weird pizza claymation or whatever it was. He was telling a story how he took his kids to Pizza Hut because he remembered what it was like when he was a kid, and it was just trash. There was garbage everywhere. It was messy. He was like, what is this? And, I'll say he's obviously joking to quite a bit, but there is a bit of truth into what he's saying, that there were things that we had that were nice that are now gone, that have fallen apart. And you mentioned it was a bureaucratic replacement. Daryl, you're talking about a grandmother and the state's replacement. I kind of feel like that's where we're going, where Pizza Hut still exists, but you go inside and it's a dry shell, lacking flavor, lacking anything other than you sit down, here's your pizza, get out.
The same thing happened after the 1960s. You go to like 1973 is when George Lucas, who was part of the New Directors movement, like these rebellious, Dennis Hopper, like all these new director types in the late 60s, Easy Rider, all that. George Lucas in 1973 makes American Graffiti, which is sort of, it began the sort of the cult of 1950s nostalgia, right? I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. It's like as much of a stereotypical kind of 1950s childhood movie as you can imagine. And he was open about like why he did it. He said, because everything that comes out now is depressing and it sucks. And for like the last several years, every film that's come out has just told us how bad we are, how evil the war is, how et cetera, and I just didn't want any more of that, and I don't think a lot of other people do too. And it started that trend. Happy Days came out like a year or two later after that, and for us, I think, we're kind of going through a similar thing. In the 80s and the early 90s are kind of our 1950s,
There's that 70s show, which was the late 90s, right?
Yep.
And the crazy thing is, I think, is this true that, that 70s show was closer to the time period when it was released than we are to the 90s now.
Ugh.
Yeah, because
gross.
So they're doing a reboot, I think. Aren't they doing a reboot, that 90s show, and it's about the cast of that 70s show?
Wow. They tried to do that 80s show. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was
Oh, I thought you were going to say no.
No, but I think it might just be that people have nostalgia for when they were kids, and they always thought it was better.
Well, that and it looks like Yum Food Brands bought, I don't know if they bought Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and KFC in 97. Basically, this Tricon Global Restaurants Incorporated in 1997. It came out of PepsiCo. It's kind of obfuscated as to who owns what here, but I think they all got merged. I just
got to point out that I have fond memories of going to Pizza Hut when I was a kid. When you would get the Book It thing, you get the little wheel or whatever with all the things you win, and you go in and you get like a little pizza because you read the books or whatever. Yeah. And Jack is obviously making he's being silly about it, but there are people on the left that are really upset about Jack's statements about Pizza Hut that genuinely confuse me. It was fun going to Pizza Hut when we were kids. Everything else is meant to be more silly and a joke, but talking about how, the things we did back then we don't do anymore, and it kind of sucks. And times won't stay the same forever. But it's just funny how angry they got.
Well, they hate fun.
Yeah,
They literally
that's
hate
true.
fun.
That's true. Yeah.
People have
I disagree.
nostalgia.
I think they're addicted to it.
People have nostalgia for their childhoods all the time, obviously, because your childhood was the time before everything got so complicated. But that is also true, like on a real societal level in this particular age, as well. Like, I don't know how old all of you guys are exactly, but I'm like right at that age where I was right in that sweet spot where I lived enough of my life, about 20 years before I ever really got on the internet. I kind of knew about it, and I would,
How old are you?
I'm 40.
Oh, okay.
And so
36.
right at that
43.
age where you have enough experience of the world, what it was like before everybody had smartphones and everything, and yet you're young enough that you can pick it up and you can learn it and you can
I think it's a little too much to stream. Or maybe I paused it. I see.
kind of get fully integrated. And it has it's radically changed things, and I think it's made things more complicated.
These kids today will not know the joy of hearing the phone ring and racing your sibling full speed to try and answer it first.
Yes.
Or watching something on television and having to go grab your snack during the commercial break.
Yeah.
Actually, to be honest, though, that is coming back to a lot of streaming services.
Well, there was real quick, there's a funny post where someone said the kids today will never know the joy of rushing to the kitchen to grab snacks during a commercial break and your sibling yelling, "It's on."
That's right.
And then it was on Tumblr. Someone said they couldn't just pause it. And then someone said, "Oh, my sweet summer child."
Oh, but that's hilarious. But I will say I do think there's more to it than nostalgia. So you mentioned the filmmakers of the 70s, and I've heard it said that part of why Star Wars was so successful, and I'm not really much of a fan, but I've heard it argued part of why it was successful is because in that era, in the 60s and 70s, so much of what was being produced was depressing, but also sort of morally ambiguous. They didn't want to have a clear-cut good guy, bad guy narrative, but Star Wars leaned very heavily into that. And now you see a lot of fans arguing online on Twitter that we need to have the gray Jedi and this series needs to be more about moral ambiguity, even though a huge part of what made it successful was the fact that they were willing to draw clear lines between what's good and bad.
It was kind of a story of Christ. Star Wars, the first one, Luke was fighting against the Empire like Jesus did, and he had magic powers like Christ did and stuff like that.
Well, it's a hero's journey.
Yeah.
The hero's journey is very much. But I want to make a point. There's a meme where the NPC guy says, "Who radicalized you?" And then the chat guy says, "I'm just a normal person from 10 years ago." A bunch of people on the left were like, "See, that proves you're conservative." And I'm just like, bro, top surgery for 14-year-old girls? There's a big difference between being progressive and just like having no control. And my point was, the eugenics movement of the progressives in the 1900s died and was considered amoral or immoral and unethical. Just because the progressives think they're going to win doesn't mean their ideas are good. And just because you oppose them doesn't mean you're a conservative. You technically, I'd argue, if you're a progressive, you hold values from the early 1900s. That sounds a bit conservative.
Artificial insemination is eugenics. I brought this up before, and people messaged me and were like, "Thank you." That kind of got glazed over.
Well, unless you mate with the very first sexually available person you meet, then you're kind of a eugenicist, right?
Well, but I mean, if we're
any selectivity at all is like you're doing a little
kind of. But hold on, look at women going to sperm banks and then getting a catalog of the males to choose from, right? So I understand the argument that like a woman will make her choices, but eugenics, I think, is better defined by preventing people from procreating.
Yeah.
And so
I think it's choosing who they procreate with, whether it's no one
eugenics
or...
was about good breeding. The idea was that you would have the best possible breeding. Now, obviously, men and women both select their mates. So when a woman goes to a sperm bank and she's like, here's the catalog of men, it's like a guy wearing a suit, it's like IQ 145 and he's 6-figure salary. That's it's an extreme version of female selection, which it's like, okay, it's a weird modernity thing. But I think eugenics is really sour and bad when it was like, we must prevent this group from having kids or terminate the children that may have these traits.
Yeah, that's the ugly head of eugenics, that's for sure.
Yeah, mate selection, I think, is normal and fine. You know, a woman's going to be like, honestly, dude, you're like, I don't want to have a baby with you. It's like, well, that's life.
It used to be like they would choose, the parents would choose who the kids married for most of history, I think.
I mean, and
we found that to be wrong.
What you're really,
you know, we did away with eugenics in terms of parents choosing who their kids would marry and dowries and all that. And then we also decided you should stop people from having kids, which is what Margaret Sanger wanted to do. Well, like look, whatever you want to argue about from the left, they want to say she wasn't racist, whatever, fine, but she did argue literally and fought very hard to stop certain people from having kids.
Yeah, no, she was absolutely racist.
One side
she was
can
eugenicist.
stop people from having
But
kids
I
by
wouldn't argue that arranged
keeping
marriage is
people
eugenics
from
because they were not selecting
aborting
the partner
a
for their
number of
child
child.
necessarily on
And
the
the other
basis
side
of something like
gonna
genetic fitness. It could be this is a
stop
morally
people from
virtuous
having
person,
kids
and
by
so
encouraging
I want my child to
abortion.
marry
Like,
them.
it just-
Or the dad is
it's
rich.
all just
Yeah.
Right.
It depended on the
contradictory
choice of the
nonsense.
parent. They could be like, I want you to have the most beautiful wife, but usually it was for money.
I mean, when it came to the royal families, they did not care for genetics at all. So I wouldn't call that eugenics.
Yeah, it's about land rights and stuff. They want the wife to have ownership, like she's going to get the county of Brussels, so I'm going to marry her to my son who has the kingdom of England,
Was
and then
it
they'll
the-
consolidate power.
All these kings in World War I were cousins. Is that
Yeah.
what it was?
Yeah.
So ridiculous.
That's what I hear. Before we go too far away from this Pizza Hut thing, Yum Food Brands was spun up to purchase KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut, and the top owners of Yum Food Brands are Vanguard,
Oh,
BlackRock
really?
at 4%, State Street at 4%,
Knew it.
T. Rowe Price Associates.
Exactly.
and
Right.
Dude, I just want to. When people say that meme reject modernity, embrace tradition, the one thing I will say, I mentioned before, when you're a tourist in key parts of the world, and you come to the famous downtown area of some city in some faraway country, and it's McDonald's, Starbucks, Gucci, Hard Rock Cafe, you just throw up a little bit. You're just like, what is this? Is this it? The world will have nothing left to offer us.
Yeah.
There's no adventure. There's no diversity. You know, the left talks about diversity all day and night, but I tell you, when I went to the Bahamas and I was like, I guess I'll go to Starbucks. I'm like, that's not fun.
The weird thing is when you're in another country and
but
they only have like
subscribers?
little like coffee shops where they're making the coffee and
I
they're
mean,
burning the bean and it doesn't taste. And you're like, oh,
already
this is
got
all.
super
Then you
chat.
see a Starbucks. It's like an
Who
oasis
even
in the
pays
desert, and you're like,
attention to
I can get a
regular
standardized
chats?
thing that I know what it's
At
going to
least they
taste
know.
like. Thank God. And you go there and you get a real coffee just exactly like it always tastes. And
That's really just
that's the
boring.
upside of this
Dude,
standardization.
Yeah. Like,
Like, I
I'm
like
gonna.
to be able to
I'll tell you
at
this: if I am in
add,
some small,
my
faraway
thoughts.
country and their burgers are
I'd be
weird
down
and
to go on
gross,
this
I
show
still will
and
not go to
talk about my
McDonald's.
ideas with
Yeah.
Not
these guys.
McDonald's.
But
Starbucks
it's
is.
I think
standard.
this is
No,
why I
Mc-
got to
Starbucks
say
is.
that I don't
I'll,
care
I'll,
anybody who's
Starbucks
on the
cold
show
brew
or
actually really.
anything.
Uh,
good.
I
yeah.
think they have quality
I gotta
coffee.
do that because Starbucks cold brew is good.
McDonald's
wanna
though,
see some
it's
of
I don't like
trash.
Starbucks
I don't
coffee,
even.
though.
I don't think of Starbucks
Part
as fast
one
food really.
of
I don't ever eat their
our
food really.
guest
So I
appearance
wanted
on
to
the
say
White
before we
Rabbit
move on to this
podcast
Pizza Hut thing,
at
I would
Catalyst
think
on Rumble.
that nostalgia would be the one thing that would be truly bipartisan, that everybody of about the same age would really resonate with. But you were talking about the sinews that hold people together at a very low level. I think this is one of those things. The fact that we can't even agree on some kind of fond childhood memory is kind of crushing to watch. Like, that's distressing that we don't even agree about that. What is wrong with us?
I think
I
it's
think,
good not to agree about things.
I think
I think it's
childhood today is being
necessary
destroyed
in
on
order to learn
purpose.
how to solve
I think we
problems
as millennials
without
have a kind of
violence.
shared experience in these cultural phenomena from when we were little, like Book It and Pizza
I
Hut.
think I end
So
up
when Jack
having closer
Posobiec posts
relationships
the
with
red
people
cups
who
and the
I
little pan
can
pizzas,
agree to disagree
many
with
of us go, I
than,
remember that. Even if it was just one
people
time you
who,
went because your school gave you those little
I can't
things, like
really
if
get
you
along with
if you read
because
enough
everybody's
books, the
agreeing
teacher would
to
sign off, and then Pizza Hut would give you a little free pizza, so you'd get it.
Or maybe they
That's a
can get
shared
along with
cultural
me, you know?
experience.
I
Now
feel
what do we
that's
have?
usually how it goes.
Well, like
The
Chop-
shared
Not
cultural
very accepting
experience is
about
all
people
like the weird
disagreeing
stuff
with
kids
me.
are being taught in schools.
Marvel movies.
Yeah, well, I was just about to bring that up. I mean, childhood has in some way been redistributed to adults, so we've extended adolescence as far
Dude,
as we
that's true.
possibly
Fuck,
could.
man.
Take a
I
look
mean,
at-
maybe not as far as we
Adult children
possibly
up
could.
in
We're
this
probably
place.
pushing to extend it even further.
I've been saying this. They are preventing adulthood. That's
Yes.
what's happening, whether
Yeah.
intentional or not. Puberty blockers preventing adulthood. Millennials have 3% Fact check me on this one, but there's a meme going around. It's like millennials have 3% of U.S. wealth and boomers have 21%.
That sounds right.
It's the poorest generation in history. And I think it's because boomers are living longer. And I think it's because millennials were poorly raised.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that it's the case that when you look at the way children are raised today, I sort of mentioned that we've redistributed childhood, right? Because we prolong adolescence, but on top of that, it's not as if we give to children what was traditionally given to them. So at a very young age, 8, 9, 10 years old, a kid is handed a smartphone, which is a tool for an adult to use, but they just use it to do unrestrained, irresponsible things, and then they continue to do that until they're 30 instead of using this tool for something productive. So it's very strange, and it's a rejection of responsibility, sadly, and no culture can function once that becomes the status quo.
Let's poll the audience in a way that unashamedly promotes the show. Smash the like button if you think kids should not have cell phones.
Especially adults who didn't grow up with the stuff.
Yeah, what do you...
I've been thinking a lot about this because we talk about kids getting access to the internet. What age should they get access to the internet, and what's it going to do to their brain to have all that information blasted at me? And then I started thinking, you know what? That happened to me when I was 26 years old. I got on YouTube and people started hitting me with all this information. So I started looking up the Federal Reserve, fiat currency, the Bank of International Settlements, the American war machine, liberal economic order, and I'm like, wow, we're not. I went insane. Society would have classified me as insane. I was completely destroyed mentally and had to rebuild what I thought I was. That's happening to kids when they're 5, 7, 8, and it's happening to adults when they're 60. So this internet's danger, man. It's the danger zone. It's a minefield for the mind. We got to treat it like that.
Yeah, and it subverts this process of growing up, right? Where, like we were talking before the show about this plan I have for my kids, where I'm going to have like a library, and there's going to be bookshelves full of books so that the kids grow up and they're just used to there being books all around. And my plan is, like, the books at the very bottom, those are going to be kids' books. You get up a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. Those are going to be the ones where I can tell my kid, you're not ready for that yet. And then they're going to be like, oh, I want that book. Now, that's something that happened like with all of childhood back in the days. There were things that you were not old enough for yet, that you don't get to see that, you don't get to experience that yet. You're just not old enough. You're not at that point. And it creates that sort of yearning to mature and grow up. And now, because of smartphones and just the permissiveness of the way we raise kids,
they have everything.
You're 7 years old. You can see anything. You can do anything.
I am shocked and offended by how you described what your children will be reading. Clearly, the only things they should be allowed to read are Harry Potter and The Handmaid's Tale.
Handmaid's Tale. Come on.
Handmaid's Tale. What was the joke?
We're making we're going to synthesize them and do a reboot that lefties will really pay money for. It's going to be called Harry Handmaid. Harry Handmaid and
Harry.
What was like Harry Handmaid and the Sorcerer's Tale, something like that, Philosopher's Tale.
So good.
You're a handmaid, Harry.
I like this idea that you're going to have books for your kids in the future. One time my dad was telling, I was in the bathtub, I was like 6 or something or 7, and he started to tell me a joke, and he was like, I'll tell you when you're older. And I was like, no, what? And he was like, I'll tell you when you're older. So like 15 years
and then it's
like
a rite of passage when he finally tells you, you're like, oh, I've arrived.
Well, 15 years went by, and I asked him, what was that joke you were going to tell me? And he was like, I don't remember what you're talking about. So make sure they get a chance to read the books.
When I was little, we had cable. And the cable box, man, I remember this is crazy. Had parental lock on it,
so
4-digit code.
Like when it comes
and
down to it,
whenever we wanted to watch Beavis and Butthead, my mom had to be like, only if I'm there,
and then
I decide you're allowed to watch it. Because some of those episodes of Beavis and Butthead, not for little kids, but some of them were just hilarious.
Yeah, there's something my dad said to me when I was growing up, which is that, and he was referring to the television, but this is the first time in human history that people let complete strangers into their house to teach their children things without any kind of filter. And when you put it that way, it becomes clear just how alarming the situation is.
But
and
is this millennials doing it?
What do you mean? Millennials? Well, my dad is referring. No, he was referring to his own generation and the fact that they sit their kids in front of the television or don't police what they're watching. They don't filter any of it. And so it's very, very sad. It's very sad. And there are so many horrible things kids get into at an early age. I mean, we're not just talking about bad political theories or horrible advice. Children end up seeing pornography at a very early age, and it warps them.
Dude, when I was in 7th grade, we had that one kid that every male friend group has who was like the pervert kid, right? And he brought a couple of his dad's Playboys to school one time. And everybody who found out about it was like, oh my God, he's got a couple Playboys. And then he got caught by the teacher, and we're like, well, he's dead. I mean, he's clearly going to be executed on the playground. Like, his life is completely over. And it's like now, today, little Johnny brings a cell phone to school, and you got to explain to your 6-year-old what X, Y, and Z are. That's terrifying.
And instead of being like kids shouldn't have cell phones, you have these teachers being like kids have questions.
Yep.
And we're going to answer them and show them graphic pictures. I love it. The Washington Post's writing that op-ed where it's like, it's a book about being genderqueer and kids need these stories. And it's being banned now. And then Amazon's like 18 and up only because it's got graphic depictions of adult activities in it.
Well, and they would not put the actual images from the book in their publication because they knew they were too depraved. But they were arguing that children should be shown those images in public schools.
That's how you know they're creeps.
Yep.
Because they know what's in the book and they're lying.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, actually, if you go back to the late 60s, how many of the radicals from that era, after they got done being, fake revolutionaries, went into early elementary education or like went into the educational training. You have guys like Daniel Cohn-Bendit out in France. He was a big revolutionary 68 guy out there. And afterwards, he went and opened a kindergarten. And then he wrote a memoir about it a few years after that. And he talked about, this is like in the mid-70s, talking about how, there's all of this sexual repression is what leads to fascism and the authoritarian personality and everything. And so if he caught like a couple of his kids like fondling each other or something, he would just sit there and like talk to them while they did it, make sure they were comfortable. Sometimes they would come up and touch him.
What?
This guy became like a politician in France. Nobody cared. It got brought up sometime in the late 90s. They tried to like use it against him and nobody cared.
Yes. So I've mentioned this on the show before, but there's a fellow by the name, or a disgusting pervert by the name of Alfred Kinsey, and he is known as the father of the sexual revolution. He is the father of sexology, or the modern scientific field of studying human sexuality. And in his published works, he had data tables that were collected by sexually abusing young boys, and this had been done to over 200 minors, boys under the age of 15, including infants. I won't explain what the data tables say on air. It's really disgusting. But so much of this stuff is completely out in the open. And the boomer generation is comedic in a sense because I remember growing up watching movies that the boomer generation made about how heroic the boomer generation was. And there's this idea that they were these brave revolutionaries because their parents, who had just lived through the Great Depression and then fought in the Second World War, came home and said, we have some advice on how the world works and you should listen to us. And they said, screw you, Mom and Dad, I'm going to have one-night stands and listen to rock and roll. And this is considered this really brave and important revolution. It was just a bunch of spoiled children. It was just a bunch of spoiled children completely tarnishing and squandering their inheritance.
I want to bring up this tweet here. It's from me. There's a tweet from Stonewall Jackson I responded to where he says, "This is so pathetic. The new Star Trek show depicts what appears to be the January 6th protests leading to the end of the world and the human race as we know it." I find the clip from the new Star Trek show very interesting. They called January 6th a fight for freedom. Yeah, no, zero. So I don't know if we can play it because they're very litigious here on YouTube. But he says it started with a fight for freedom. Shows audit the vote on January 6th and then the protests from the summer. And he says it ultimately led to the eugenics war and then finally World War III, where hundreds of thousands of species were wiped out. But hold on there a minute. Is that not plausible? It starts with a fight for freedom, so they describe. January 6th, they show. Kind of crazy they would call January 6th a fight for freedom, but sure. Led to the eugenics wars. Well, hold on. What's happening right now? Roe v. Wade is being banned, and the left is going to the homes of Supreme Court justices, and there's a nonprofit, pro-life nonprofit, at a Molotov cocktail thrown through its window, reportedly. That's the accusation. And several pro-life pregnancy centers were vandalized. In this show, where maybe they didn't realize it, it makes sense. It's plausible. In today's day and age, a eugenics war? Yeah, the abortion issue.
I think it's kind of poorly written because if there was really, because then they go, it led to which led to civil war, which then led to world war.
Well, he says ultimately World War III.
Ultimately World War III. What he would really be saying is then China and the United States, and he talk about World War. The stuff leading up to it is forgotten.
Well,
hold on. I think this actually works. Let me break it down for you.
It's political crap.
You've got January 6th, a fight for freedom, as he calls it. You then have, people are fighting, tensions are rising. Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and then all of a sudden you have blue states outright saying abortion, even in Virginia, after birth. And the media will claim it's not true, but we all heard what Northam said. The baby would be delivered resuscitated if that's what they wanted, and kept comfortable, and then a conversation would happen, which basically means what? Fine.
What's the conversation about?
Let's just say, well, he wasn't specific. Colorado, limitless, no restricted abortion. Could this lead to a conflict, which is about whether or not some people should not have kids or should? It's happening. How could it then become World War III? He may be oversimplifying it. But the political conflict inside the United States could ultimately result in a unipolar world destabilizing, China expanding in various countries, Russia expanding in Eastern Europe, the U.S. still trying to maintain unipolar dominance, and then World War III. I think it's fascinating they wrote this through it, but I will start with the point where they describe January 6th as a fight for freedom.
Yeah, I think,
What?
and I'm sure you know this, I appreciate your analysis, but obviously they were trying to smear the right, more or less put it on conservatives. You really don't think so? You think they're trying to be neutral?
In what way could you, he literally shows January 6th as a fight for freedom. How could you in any way say he's trying to smear them?
Well, I think when you look at the track record of Hollywood and their analysis of current events, they tend to come down on the side of the left. And I would also argue that for a television show to explicitly say they were in favor of what happened on January 6th would basically be suicide.
You would have said it started with disinformation riling up disaffected citizens into believing their country was stolen from them and rioting, which sparked a civil war. No, he said a fight for freedom.
I think January 6th wasn't a fight. There was a few people that got into it, maybe, but it wasn't. It was just a protest.
Maybe he was talking about the feds, and he's like, those feds were fighting for freedom.
It does then show Summer of Love stuff, so.
Yeah, so also, it's possible, they write the dialogue, and then the editor ends up placing certain images over the dialogue that the writer might not have intended. But, I think I agree with you, Ian, about the point that it's a little bit lazy. So it's not abnormal for a science fiction show about the future to comment on current events, or at least contemporary culture, but to do it in a really over-the-top way like this seems really lazy. Instead of creating an allegory for it, or having characters in the future present a situation you might be more detached from than the current event, they are literally showing things that happened today and commenting on it.
I think it's a ripoff of a Star Trek episode where Data asks about terrorism, because they visit a planet where there are terrorists, and then he mentions, Data says, I don't understand some elements of their conduct. We say it's wrong to do these things, but it's actually been quite successful for many groups. And then he mentions Mexico, Ireland, and then he mentions a fictitious 2020, 2022 or 2220 something event, Star Trek world. And basically what Data does is he asks a question about terrorism, using real historical elements and then a fictitious sci-fi element from the future we haven't encountered yet. It seems to be the exact same thing they're doing. It's lazy. It's very lazy.
I mean, it's video footage from last year, too.
That's why I watch Star Trek. That's why I watch sci-fi shows about the future. I want to see video footage from last year.
Yeah, right.
That's a
laziness.
easy road
But
to go
I don't
down.
know. I find it fascinating. I wonder,
Laziness or short-sightedness, or like a lack of creativity on or a political underhanded move by the writers.
I don't think you can. I mean,
or
I haven't
maybe
seen the
this is
clip, but
storytelling that
I
they
don't
do
think you
right
can
in front
put
of us.
a
They tell us
January
exactly
6th
the
clip
truth.
in
They
that
tell us exactly
context on a
what's gonna
show
happen
without
and
it
is
being
happening.
a political decision.
And
I think
they
that's something
act
that's done on
like
purpose.
it's-
Yeah. Absolutely.
not
well, that
because
also
it's
shows the
entertainment.
George Floyd rights.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So,
Well, but and of course,
They
this
hide
kind of
what they're
thing
doing in
affects
plain sight
rewatchability.
to
Like if you
entertainment.
people will go back and rewatch episodes of TNG or the original series, and I really don't think people are going to be going back and rewatching this 15, 20 years from now. Not many of them.
I'm not watching it the first time.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly,
a huge Star Trek
exactly.
fan. They've just, you know what it is? I don't know. They hired a bunch of people who hate Star Trek to write Star Trek.
Is
so-
this the one with Stacey Abrams? She made an appearance as like the president of the planets or something. Did you guys?
That was Discovery, I think. Stacey Abrams, the president of Earth.
Okay, political Star Trek trash again. They have a politician as a character.
You know,
Why do
you
they
mentioned
do
this
this?
earlier. We were talking before the show about the late night TV and how they're in the key demo. We actually rival some late night television shows, which is actually really bad for them because they used to get 20 million views. And the funny thing is, you mentioned how older people watch those shows. They used to watch it every night, but now all of a sudden they're being made fun of. This is the funny thing. Like Jimmy Kimmel, for instance, and like the late night, the people who are watching CNN, the people who are watching these shows, the overwhelming majority are like 60 to 70 years old, and they're trying to make the politics of these shows fit a millennial leftist or progressive worldview. And it's like, well, that's not the boomer generation. So your show used to actually attract tens of millions of people in the boomer generation. You've decided to sacrifice all of that for millennials who consume digital media.
They should just be making a new show. They should keep that show with older hosts to keep talking to the older crowd that was young in the 80s when David Letterman was in his 30s. And then they should have a new show, but they're competing for time slots, which is also archaic because people watch stuff on YouTube at any time of day. You don't need it's stuff's on demand now. Industry, I don't know. I don't want to make a generalization about industry being slow to adopt the hot new thing, but the entertainment industry sure is. They were still making me mail headshots in like 2008 because sending a digital thing was apparently they just didn't it was too new, so it wasn't good.
Are we just going through the natural progression of old fogeyism where we're like, it was better when I was a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 27, but I'm already there.
New content is bad.
I did hear you say these kids today.
Remember the Simpsons thing where Abe was talking to a young Homer and he's like, it'll happen to you too. It was like, I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what it is scary to me.
I think kids
it'll happen to you.
I think children today are smarter than the previous generation intellectually, and their minds work quicker. And that's the natural progression of evolution. But emotionally, we're experiencing some challenges because of the disconnectedness of the technology.
You know what I was thinking though? I wonder if that's true. Because I know kids today are still very much passionate about capturing small animals and forcing them to fight each other.
Yeah. It's really big deal.
We went to a bowling alley arcade the other day, and all the kids just love forcing animals to fight. Brutally just beat each other, and tons of Pokemon toys everywhere.
Yeah.
I grew up with Pokemon. I remember when it I guess it first started in America, and I bought Pokemon Red on the original Game Boy with money I made at my family's cafe from tips. And today, kids are still very much watching Pokemon, and the toys are like the big prize at the arcade were Pokemon stuff.
I was talking to somebody I guess a couple months ago now. Did you know there are Pokemon cards that get sold for $500,000?
Yes,
I didn't know it was
a
that
ton
much.
of them.
Gary Vee is a big proponent of
He
that.
had to show me on his phone. I did not believe him.
The funny thing is, like, having owned so many foil first edition Pokemon cards and then just like having lost them or sold them,
Painful.
now it's like a laughable when I'm like, that's how much they're going for these days. Wow,
because the printing run was so low.
I don't know, because look, millennials are broke, right? Millennials are relatively poor, so who cares that much about Pokemon other than nostalgic millennials? So I guess there's a spattering of wealthy millennials who are like, I would like to buy a Charizard for $1 million.
It's got to just be speculators in the market, right? I don't think it's like a Pokemon fan who's like, I've got to have that card.
There's some dude who's like, there's like a Gen Z. I mean,
he mowed a lot of lawns that summer, and he needed that Pokemon card.
No. Think about it. If you're Gen Z right now, it is a great bet to buy old Pokemon cards, because once the boomers age out and then millennials inherit a lot of this wealth, you're going to have a bunch of nostalgic, rich 60-year-old millennials, and you're going to be in your mid-40s, and you're going to be like, you want that Charizard? I got it. And that $100,000 is going to be $10 million.
That theme that you just talked about millennials not having any money has come up a couple times, and it seems like that's one of the threads that kind of ties everything together politically and socially right now, right? Where if you go back to like the late 60s again, people, middle-aged people were looking at the colleges, looking at the youth movement, and they were like, oh my God, like when these people take over our society, like actually go out and get into authority positions, like I guess we're just done. And this is the end of America, the end of the world. And of course it turned out not to be that way, because those people got out of college and they got jobs and bought houses and had kids. And then once you get to that point, you kind of care about what your community is going to be like in 10 years. You care about what kind of schools your kids are going to. That's another way of saying you basically become a conservative in a lot of important, like, dispositional ways. You look at the millennial generation, and so what happens, right? So every like 25 years or so is like when that happens. In the past, you get to about 25, maybe late 20s. By that point, your parents are starting to be like, "Are you not going to get married yet? Like, what's going on?" That was the timing of it. The millennials, it's had like that period, that young person period, has had so much more room to run because they're in their mid to late 30s and they're not able to get married and have kids and buy houses or create a stable career.
I don't think that's it. I've heard a lot from millennials where they're like, we'd be getting married and having kids if it wasn't for this economy. And I'm like, I don't believe it. I just think that's an excuse. I think
dude,
people are just permanent children.
Well, the economy's in a horrific state. When Obama bailed out Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, and when we all found out we were on fiat currency and not the gold standard in 2007, everybody got the red pill. That was like, and now are we in hyperinflation right now? I don't know if you'd call it hyperinflation, but we've just almost doubled our money supply.
I'll call myself outright. I'm 36. I am not married. I'm in a relationship, but we have no kids. There is something about millennials where it didn't happen.
Well, but values change to accommodate reality, right? I mean, like, I just think about, I was just ahead of this curve. I guess I got lucky for that. But if you're about 35, about your age, you basically got out of high school, 9/11 happens. We've been at war ever since you've been anything like an adult, right? And the only politics that you've known is people screaming at each other, calling each other Nazis and so forth, and that's it. That's our politics as far as since you've ever been paying attention to politics. That's what it's been. You just get out of college, and like the year or two after you get out of college, the financial crisis hits, and things are just a waste for several years. You finally start to maybe get back on your feet in your mid-30s, and you're starting to put something together. COVID hits. Like, this is just an incredible amount of instability for any generation to handle. The millennials are going to be the first generation in American history that has a lower standard of living than their parents do.
Yep.
And you cannot overstate, I think, how significant that is, right? Because it's not just that, like, my parents had a house that was this big and I only get a house that's this big. What people relate it to, like what their basic standard of what a life should look like, is how things were when they were growing up. And so you have an entire generation of people who in the aggregate grew up a certain way and are starting to realize and understand that they are going to take a step back from where that was. And that's, it's not some like huge mystery why we get Bernie Sanders at a time like this.
There's this viral video about pod housing where people, these companies will buy like a decently large loft and then stack up like 5 little cubes and then 5 on top, and you crawl into this little, it's probably 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and you crawl into your little mat on the floor with your TV and your art, and that's your pod. Everyone shares the kitchen and bathrooms, and there's videos of these millennials being like, it's just so awesome, it's only $800 per month, and it's just like oh no,
that's
for real.
So much.
You want to live in some of these cities, man.
It's only $400 a month with a roommate.
This is what you're gonna get. Communism. You're gonna get little hippie houses, buildings where there's gonna be like 50 millennials all living in it, and they're sharing their kids. Like their kids are gonna be just communal kids. I mean,
I saw a tweet, and I need to verify this one, but I believe it was from the World Economic Forum, and it showed young people about our age living in a tiny house, and it said if you own a big house, you're racist. You need to own a small house. You need to own nothing and be happy about it. And I was telling my dad about this when he came out a little while ago. I said, Dad, I feel a great sense of almost resentment, but very much a sense of missing something that we never had, because I know now that the American dream that I grew up with is not something that I will ever see. I will never see my white picket fence. That's not something that I'm never going to have.
Yeah, the American dream was based on imperialism and war. It wasn't a real thing.
I think one of the issues is I also think millennials are the first generation of mass debt college students. I don't think Gen X, for the most part, was inundated at the same way the millennials were. The boomers certainly weren't. So one of the issues is I believe, when I grew up, every single adult was like, you have to go to college. And I would just be like, why? And they would be like, because otherwise you won't get a good job. And then I'm just like, I don't understand. Well, I've told this story before. I read an op-ed from an economist, I think he worked under Clinton, where he said that if you went to any investor and said, you give me $40,000 in an investment, and in 4 years, you will owe me $40,000 plus interest, and that's it, they would laugh in your face. That's the stupidest investment I've ever heard of. But this is what we're telling every 18-year-old to do, to take out a loan with interest that gets them no guarantees. They don't know why they're going to college. They don't know where they're going to work when they get out. And a bunch of these millennials went in for liberal arts, and now they're slammed with debt, confused. But we had the boomer generation. I tell you, man, they were screaming in my ears. They wouldn't shut up about it. So now you have an entire generation saddled with impossible debt. just hating the system, all of the problems you mentioned with war, with the financial collapse, the security state. And I think they've just lost the ability to function in any meaningful way relative to the past generations.
Well, I think he hit on a good point. It's something I really worry about, right? Which is maybe there are no economic policies that we're going to have or anything that are actually going to get things back to where they were in the 50s and 60s. Maybe all of that was a relic of the fact that the entire world got destroyed and deindustrialized in World War II, except for us, and they all needed American labor and American capital. And we're 5% of the world's population. We got 30% of the world's resources flowing into the imperial center, and maybe that was just never sustainable. And you just wonder, like, even if we're 5% of the world's population, if we only got 15% instead of 30% of the world's resources, we're still probably at the top of the heap. I don't think we could handle. I think there would be a violent revolution if we had to take a 50% cut in our standard of living in this country.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was never something sustainable.
I think people just got to learn to go live in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of people live in the middle of nowhere are like, no, you're going to ruin the middle of nowhere. Don't tell them to come here.
Well, but that's the difficulty, right? Like, I remember when the Yellow Vest protests were going on in France, and I read an article by one of the leaders of it, and the thing he said was, this is true in France, it's true in the United States to a large degree, is that the places that you actually have to go to work are becoming increasingly concentrated in a few urban centers. Those places are becoming impossible to actually live because they're so expensive because everybody has to go there. It's like there's probably more, jobs out in the middle of nowhere if you're willing to be an electrician or a plumber or something like that instead of, but we've spent just God knows how many hours and how many dollars of propaganda to convince people that makes them a failure in their life if they end up doing that. So
one of the biggest challenges as we're trying to build this new studio is we're trying to find a local expert in folklore mythology, but we just can't find any. If only there was someone who can come and read us the ancient words that could help us. I have no idea how to help build our facility.
If only they can do a feminist analysis of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
You'll find that.
Yeah.
That would actually be a good bit we should do, where it's in order to get the new studio built, we had to bring in a feminist interpretive dancer. Like you see that Parliament thing, like European Parliament, where they're just dancing, and it's
I think regarding what you said about standard of living, that was interesting that this would be the first generation to have a standard of living less than the generation before. And I wonder, maybe financially, I agree with you financially for sure. That's what it looks like. But my parents' generation got drafted into Vietnam, destroyed their standard of living. Annihilated the entire generation. It ruined their lives. And World War I annihilated the entire generation.
Give them a little more time with Russia. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, so that's why I'm so anti-war. If you think that even considering a war right now is any benefit, you got to understand what countries do with large uneducated and what do you call when they don't have a job? Unemployed masses. Countries do with those people, they send them to war to die, so they don't have to feed them and take care of them. So you do not want to push for a war.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, I think you made a very interesting point about America sort of stepping in after the Second World War and becoming this economic powerhouse. And I hadn't considered that before. And I want to give it some thought, but another point I like to make when it comes to the change in the standard of living is the fact that the workforce really became oversaturated because we doubled the labor supply once we decided that rather than a sole breadwinner, rather than the father representing the family unit economically in working, we were going to have both parents work because that was somehow, women's liberation. We ended up in a position where your average worker now had half the negotiating power. And so I think that's been seriously detrimental to this country. But ultimately, whether you're talking about, a crony capitalist system or a capitalist system which is not managed virtuously or a communist system, in the end, you have a really horrific situation where your average person does not have property and therefore no investment in the system.
Yeah, this whole BlackRock owning property thing's got to go.
Let's just start from step one, and this isn't a value statement or a moral statement. Women largely enter the workforce starting in the 70s and the late 70s, right? That's when we, for our parents' generation, it was like they were young adults. Like all of a sudden, women were getting jobs. For me, I grew up; it was always the case. But once women are in the workforce, you now have both men and women focused on the breadwinning aspect of life and no familial aspect of life. So who's going to raise the kids? Well, daycare becomes a question. They now say we need, businesses to offer daycare for our kids or public schooling. Mm-hmm. The government has to replace the family.
Yep.
And that is not going to work out well for anybody.
It's this slow creep where, like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right, talked about this with technology, how a car is invented. And it's like, wow, now I can get a car and I can drive wherever I want. Like I could only walk or ride my bike before. Now I can drive. I have the freedom of the road. Let a little bit of time go by. And now having a car is not an option. You have to have a car to survive in our society at all. Yep. And you're commuting 45 minutes to work every day, stuck in traffic, and you have no choice. And it's kind of similar here. Like, oh, wow, women can go out and get a career. They can go out and get jobs now. Well, give it a couple years, and now women have to get jobs. Both parents have to work just to survive because wages have stagnated and costs have gone up. And it has a way of working like that.
I never hear the left talk about that. They always show these graphs where it's like, I wonder what happened in 1979. And then I see this meme where it's like labor unions started losing power. And I'm like, it's true, but you double the workforce and your bargaining power gets cut in half overnight. And not just that, but you've got somebody who's running a business, and they say to the guy, so tell me about your family. And it's like, oh, my wife works here, and we're planning this and this, and I need X amount of dollars. It's like, your wife's got a job. You don't need that much money. Like the collective salary between you and your wife is going to be $75K. You're fine.
Yeah, I think the expectation is that you're going to be a dual income household, and so you don't need to be paid a wage that would be sufficient for supporting a family. And just to clarify something I said earlier, I said that people who don't have property don't have a stake in the system. I misspoke. They don't have as much of a stake. There's still a stake in the system, but they are much easier to control.
What is the phrase? DINK? Is that it is?
Dual income, no kids.
No
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Easier to bully.
I mean,
I think there's some because I don't want. I think property is very important, but I don't want to say like if somebody has no property, then like